Hi everyone, welcome to the final episode of my Busch Gardens Williamsburg recreation. So for the majority of 2024, I've been working on this build of Busch Gardens in Williamsburg, Virginia. It's a fantastic park. If you haven't been there yourself, I highly recommend it. I've been there a few times. I worked on this build for the park recreation contest that was held over at the DKMP Discord for the year of 2024. So as per usual, since this is the final episode of the series, we're just going to be going on a nice little tour through the park. I'm going to be showing off everything that I built, doing a little bit of a recap if you haven't seen the original series, probably repeating myself a little bit, but if you haven't, you might enjoy seeing some of the things I built for this park. And of course, there will be lots of links in the description if you want to download this and take a look for yourself. So let's start up here at the front of the park. Not a whole lot to say about it, although I will mention one of the last episodes I worked on the parking lot. I feel like the techniques for making parking lots haven't changed a whole lot over the last few years, but I'm quite proud of this one. I think it looks pretty nice, and it is a nice little introduction to the park. It makes it feel a bit more lived in, especially with all the cars I was able to place. Not as tedious as it used to be anymore, thanks to plugins and all that. Entrance of the park here, we have some guest services buildings, some restrooms, nothing too crazy going on, just some small buildings. And that does lead us into the main entrance, the front ticket gates of the park, and into the first themed area. If you're unfamiliar with Busch Gardens, all of its themed areas are styled after different European countries. So we have the England area up here at the front. Not much going on in this area of the park. There is just a theater over here and some food stalls and shops. Not a ton for peeps to do, but as it is the entrance, it's always a little bit crowded here. Lots of hungry peeps hanging out, getting something to eat. As you can see, I'm using a lot of the expansion scenery pieces from the European and Dark Age theming to get some of these styled walls. They look like they do in real life quite closely, but it is really hard to make some nice looking buildings out of them because you're very limited to what shapes you could make. Some of the textures are a little wonky. They don't match the base game scenery textures very well. So I'm doing a little bit of mixing and matching to try to get something that looks a little bit visually interesting and not too gross. So some parts of the park I feel like it works out okay, some parts it doesn't. I still feel like England's probably one of my least favorite parts of the park. I haven't spent as much time in here as in other areas of the park, but it's not as big, so I didn't really see it as a very high priority, I suppose. Next to England, we have our main kiddie area. This is the Sesame Street Forest of Fun. Just a couple small rides in this area. We have a kiddie drop tower here. Just a nice little hack on this one, using a little bit of chain lift to get it to bounce up and down for a bit before finally coming back down to the ground. So not just your typical drop tower. I do think is a pretty neat design, even though it does look a little bit big compared to everything else in the area, but that's just the way that the drop towers in the game work. That's the way they're scaled. Next to that, we've got a mini disco. I'm trying to use some corkscrew cars here to kind of emulate the rectangular seat that you sit in on a ride like this. I don't think it works particularly well, but with non-custom vehicles, there's really not a ton of great options. I feel like the Roto-Drop ride, which you usually see used for discos, was a bit too big. Since this one's on a much smaller scale, you needed something a little bit smaller that seated fewer people. So probably a ride that could use a little bit more experimentation to find a build that works well for non-custom objects. Over here we have a little play area. I don't believe there's anything for peeps to do in here. I think there might be a hidden restroom back here. And there is also a small boat ride, which used to be one of the most popular rides in the park back at the beginning of the build. Probably because at the time it had a pretty good excitement rating, comparatively speaking, for all the scenery around it, but not as popular anymore, unfortunately. We have our first coaster over here as well, Grover's Alpine Express. Just a little kiddie coaster. Nothing too unusual about this one. I've said in the past that when building kiddie coasters, sometimes they're really difficult to get right because of the scale of the game, and you can't make them quite small enough and still keep all the elements in there. This one is like just on the border of being unbuildable because it's a little bit bigger than some of the kiddie coasters I've built before. For example, the one in Dorney Park. It's very tiny, hard to build right. This one has enough going on that I think the scale works okay. The layout itself is a little bit janky. I'm still not a big fan of the S-bend here at the end and this extended banked straight section here to get you from the first half to the second half of the ride. But given the tools available to us, Could do a lot worse, I suppose. All right, moving back to the actual European areas of the park, unless they're implying that Sesame Street is in Europe, which I don't think is canonically true. Let's move along to the left here. Towards the Italy area, we've got Escape from Pompeii, the splash boat ride. Big fan of this one, both in real life as a splash boat ride, and I think my build here turned out really nice. Busch Gardens really does go all in on their theming, and I think it pays off because I've been on a couple splash boats and most of them are very boring, but this one actually has some nice stuff going on inside. There's a nice show building in here with some fire effects and things like that, so I have a little cutout here to show off some of that. So yeah, very pleased with the style and build that I was able to get done for the show building in here. So yeah, really happy with this. Moving along into Italy proper, there's a lot going on in this area of the park. We've got our first big coaster, Apollo's Chariot, the prototype B&M hypercoaster. A pretty standard build, and for RCT, nothing too crazy going on. Just a lot of hills, as you'd expect, so I didn't have to do any crazy hacks or anything to get it to look pretty accurate compared to real life. I feel like the flow is pretty nice. It helps that it's at the edge of the park. There's not a lot around it, so I was able to build this one without having to worry about the layout of the park itself interfering with anything, and I could just sculpt the terrain around it as I needed. So that all turned out to work pretty well. Next to it we have Tempesto, the premier skyrocket coaster. If you watch the rest of the series, when I was originally talking about Tempesto, one of the things I mentioned was that I was disappointed that I could not find a way to get it to run with the 3-car train that it's supposed to. I could only get it to work with 2-car trains. And if you noticed, it is now running with 3-car trains. So thanks to user Timmy Tuner, who took a look at my save file and was able to hack together a way to make it run with 3 cars. There's a bit of wackiness going on here where instead of the cars being car 1 in front, car 2 in the middle, car 3 in the back, it's actually car 2 in front, car 1 in the middle, and car 3 in the back. And for some reason, that changes the way that the game calculates the physics of the train or something like that. I don't really understand how it works, but I'm not going to question it because it works and it looks like it's supposed to, so I'm pretty happy about that. The only thing it doesn't do is go forward out of the station at the very end of the ride to lose all the momentum. It just comes to a very abrupt halt in the station. A little unrealistic, but considering that everything else about this ride I think is correct, pretty happy with it. So big fan of this Tempesto build. Very happy with the way it turned out. As for the rest of Italy, we have a couple other spinny rides. We've got teacups here. We have I think like a mini Music Express and a standard size Music Express. Pretty standard builds, pretty typical shoestring kind of rides. If you've seen me build any of these similar rides in my other park builds, same thing going on here. Just a shoestring with a bunch of cars going in a circle, so not a whole lot to talk about with those. But I think they look pretty good, especially a big fan of the way that the shape of the Music Express here looks. Most of the real life buildings for rides like this are pretty plain and boring because normally you're not looking at them from the top. So when you build them in RCT, they look kind of boring. I did take a little bit of artistic liberties with some of the actual buildings in my build to make them look a little bit different. Some of them work out okay as is, but some of them I tweaked a little bit to make them look a little bit nicer. For example, this restaurant and restroom back here, I had a different build very early on that was supposed to match the real life build a little bit better, but I didn't like the look of it. It looked pretty plain, looked kind of blocky. So I experimented with some different builds, some different textures, layering some different pieces on to make things look different. Just playing around with different stuff to see how it looked. And I came up with something that looked okay. You could probably spend a lot more time on any of the buildings in this area, try to get them to look more interesting. But at some point you have to draw a line between trying to copy reality and building something that looks good in the game. Similarly, we have Roman Rapids over here, the River Rapid ride. I added a lot more Roman themed decoration over here. Some more of the classical pieces like these little temples and columns and things to make this look a little bit more interesting from the player's point of view. I don't believe there's a whole lot to see in real life when you're on this ride, but I did try to give the landscaping in my build a bit more of a thematic flair than it has normally, trying to use a lot more of these Mediterranean style trees to kind of match the Italian flavor of the area. I think it worked out pretty well. This is a nice little area. Finally, at the back of Italy, we have Pantheon, the Intamin triple launch coaster. I think this one turned out okay too. Did some pretty wild hacks to get this to work with a triple launch, but I think the end result works out pretty well. And the timing and speeds I think worked out great, because in the first launch it does get pretty far over the top of the hill before losing momentum and going backwards, pretty much just like the real thing. So I really like the way that looked, and then it just barely makes it over the top there at the end. As you can see, I've obviously added a lot more decoration in here as well. In real life, this area of the park is not themed whatsoever, but I thought it would be nice to add a little bit more decoration here so it's a little bit more pleasing to the eye, a little bit more for the RCT player to look at. So just some more of the classical Roman architecture and plants going on in here. I think it turned out okay. Still not one of my favorite areas of the park. It still looks maybe a little bit empty. Not really sure what I'm missing in here, but maybe that's just a me thing, having stared at this game for so long. I'm always finding things I think could be improved, even if they are really just fine. Anyway, the other section of Italy over here, we have a couple flat rides, nothing too crazy over here. Some more small shoestrung rides and some vanilla flats. We've got a swinging ship and a scrambler over here. Definitely a challenge to try to get this area of the park built in a way that the pathing all made sense and there was enough room for all the rides and some nice garden work. Busch Gardens is a very beautiful park, and they've won a lot of awards for their landscaping and their theming. And I want to try as best as I could to replicate that here by adding a lot of gardens, a lot of very well manicured foliage, and not just spamming trees everywhere. Even though spamming trees everywhere sometimes work out, sometimes looks really good, you want to add some gardens in here as well to try to match that. Sometimes the gardens kind of blend in with the forest areas though, so it's a little bit hard to tell what's supposed to be nicely manicured and what isn't. But I guess that's just RCT for you. With no custom scenery objects, there's only so much you can do. Finally, over here, the back of Italy, we have this large food court area. They've got a stage for shows and things, and a bunch of seating and some restaurants and bathrooms back here. This is another area I wish I could have scaled a little bit better. I feel like this whole thing should be a little bit bigger, but if it was, it would have to expand either towards Pantheon, which would kind of get in the way there, or towards the river, which would also kind of get in the way. I think since I finished this area in the series, I did expand this by like one tile, push a few of these buildings back a little bit, but I don't know if it really did enough to make this look as big as it's supposed to. But oh well, I still think it looks pretty nice for what it is. It does mean that our bridge over to Germany is in the wrong spot. The actual connection is more like over here, but if we did that, it wouldn't go in the right direction at all to get towards the Germany area. But that's okay. I think it still worked out just fine the way it is. So speaking of, that takes us to the Germany area. A lot of cool stuff going on over here. Obviously we have Verbolten. This is one of my favorite coaster builds that I did for the park. It's got a nice big station with a lot of interesting shapes to it, which I think plays to RCT's strengths really well. Unfortunately, most of the coaster is hidden inside this show building. I did add some cutouts in here so you could see a little bit of the track, and I threw in some decoration as well to kind of give it a little bit more visual interest. You can also see the drop track over here. It looks a little bit silly as the coaster goes through it, but I wanted to show off that it was there, and it is actually a fully implemented drop track. But most of the ride is indoors. All the outdoor parts, not too terribly exciting. You have the launch up into the mid course on this little bridge and then down over the river. It is a very cool ride in real life. I'm a big fan of this one. So happy to get this looking pretty good in my build here. Back behind it, there isn't a whole lot going on. You have a couple buildings here, which used to be the Drakenfire station, I believe. And from what I understand, they're going to be repurposing these buildings for the new Big Bad Wolf coaster, which, as you can see, I haven't built in this park because as I was working on it, we didn't have official announcements or plans or anything for it yet. I think those are all out there now. I don't know if there are official diagrams or animations of the ride yet. I'll have to do some research into that. But at some point, if I wanted to build the new Big Bad Wolf over here, there's definitely plenty of room for it. So that might be something I might look into in the future. We'll see. I'm not going to promise anything, but could be a fun little project. Also over here, some pretty basic rides. We've got a couple of dodgems over here, the two Autobahns, and another little swinging flat ride. Just more spinning in a circle, nothing too exciting. Next to that, we've got Fest House. This is the big food court area. Lots of seating, lots of places to get food. I did add a little cutout in the roof so you could see some people walking around. See the benches in here, the long picnic tables. Not a ton going on inside. We can use cutaway view and see some of the restaurants in here. I didn't really theme it much though. There's a stage back here, but there's not a whole lot going on with it. Not the most exciting build. This is one of the last things I built in the park, and I was getting a little bit tired of working on it in general, so I kind of wanted to get it just kind of done and out the door. It is a very odd building to build an RCT, making gigantic flat buildings like this in the game. It's tough to make them look interesting. A couple other small flat rides in here. We have a wave swinger, very typical design, basically exactly like the one that I built in Dorney Park. Very standard RCT design I've seen a lot of people do with the spiral slide base, Enterprise for the top, some wooden coaster for the top as well. I think it turned out pretty good. We've got our Roto Drop mock tower, which has been torn down as of last year, I think, but I still wanted to keep it in my build because, you know, there's not much going on else in this part of the park. It's always nice to have another tall eye catcher here to make this area look interesting. Got Dark Coaster back here as well inside this building. Not much to see. I did add a couple cutouts here, one in the roof and one in the side, so you might be able to spot the train going by every now and again. There it goes. But since this is a very small coaster, very compact, the layout itself inside isn't particularly interesting, so there's not much actual decoration going on in here. Because, yeah, it's not a very exciting coaster to look at because it's in the dark, so there's not much to look at. So I think for this build at least, just having the basic building in here with the castle facades and the cutouts, I think that did a good enough job of kind of showing off what the coaster was about. So leaving the Oktoberfest section of Germany into the other area, which I forget its name. A lot of the different themed areas of the park, they have different sub areas with different names. And I had them written down in my ride inventory, but I have not memorized them, so apologies for that. This is the area of the park that houses Alpengeist, the B&M invert. I'm a big fan of the way this one turned out. I'm really happy with this. This is a tough coaster to piece together because the front half, especially this emblem right here, the layout is a little bit strange. A lot of weird angles that are hard to pull off in RCT. So it definitely went through quite a few drafts trying to get this one to look good, but I think the end result turned out pretty nice. I also appreciate that there's a lot of snow theming on the ride. I made it a little bit more themed than usual. I just wanted to accentuate the snowy mountain thing that we have going on back here with some extra trees, some snow trim on the station. I think it looks pretty good. I think it turned out well. Next to that, we have our other kiddie area, which looks like it is a peep trap. I should probably figure out how to fix that before I finalize this save. But we have a play area and some more of these small spinny rides. Again, nothing too exciting going on. Pretty typical stuff. All right, we have fixed one path issue over here. Freed everyone who was in this part of the park. It's always great to look at a gigantic park that you haven't touched in a while and come back to it, and then you find all kinds of things that are wrong with it, and you get to discover them in real time on camera. That's okay, fixing them as I go. But I think we might have exchanged one peep trap for another because now everyone's over here, all trying to leave the park. It might just be a side effect of the fact that the pathing around here is a little bit confusing for RCT peeps. As we all know, they're notoriously stupid and have a really hard time finding the park exit. I think that's where most of these people are trying to go. But the closest exit to them is through Fest House. There's a hidden exit in there, and a lot of people are having trouble finding that. Anyway, let's continue our tour. If we cross the bridge here, that takes us into the New France part of the park. Couple cool rides back here. We have Liscoot, the big log flume. This one was a bit tricky to build because it interacts very much with Invader, the wooden coaster next to it, but it also has a diagonal lift hill in real life, so I had to figure out an alternative way to do that, make these two things fit together. So it looks a little bit silly having the lift hill like this with two sections to it, but not sure if there's a better way I could have done it. Anyway, next to that we have Invader, as I said, a little wooden coaster. Not much exciting to say about this one. Pretty standard build. No crazy hacks or anything to get this one done. A lot of custom supports. Gotta get those big boxy steel structures in here. If you look okay, I feel like it's a bit much, especially on this last turnaround, but that's just because it's so high off the ground. Looks a little bit strange. Probably would have looked a lot better if I didn't have to work around Liscoot and I could have maybe raised the ground level a little bit here. But Busch Gardens is a very hilly park, and I did want those elevation changes to come across where it made sense. Elsewhere in the France and New France area, a lot of little buildings, a lot of little, I think, shops and places to get food. Nothing too crazy to talk about over here. One of our train stations, a small scrambler. These were a pain in the ass to get right. And when I was originally building this part of the park, I did get pretty discouraged and did have to take a pretty long break. And it doesn't look like there's anything too agonizing going on over here. But for some reason, just making all these buildings and trying to fit everything in here just really discouraged me for some reason for a bit. Maybe I was getting burnt out because I was going pretty hard on the build at that point and I needed to take a break and didn't realize it. So definitely could have spent some more time on here making this area look a little bit nicer, but that's okay. Here at the front of France, we've got our theater area over here. Pretty happy with the way this turned out. Made some little bleachers here out of coaster track. I think that looks pretty good. I've never done anything quite like this before, so for a first attempt, I suppose, could be worse. Our little stage area over here. Some entertainers walking around. It's always fun. And of course we have Griffin, our B&M dive coaster. This one is really tricky to get right. I've talked about this a lot already, but this has a pretty strange layout here. I have the station and the lift hill on a diagonal to try to fit things in right. I think for the most part it turned out okay. It does look a little bit different from real life on the back half here. The splashdown isn't really near any of the path like it's supposed to be, and there is a little airtime hill before it that is just missing completely. I did spend a little bit of time trying to see if I could fit that in here, but it didn't really work out very well. You'd have to push this turnaround back a whole lot, and it kind of ran into Alpengeist a bit. I think if I could go back and do the whole thing over again, it might have been able to work out if I were doing it from scratch, but since everything was already built, trying to redo part of the ride was just pretty tricky and didn't work out very well. So not my favorite build, and definitely one that doesn't look great in RCT, but I think given the strangeness of the way that Griffin looks in real life, trying to translate that to the game, I guess you could do worse. So from here, leaving France, that takes us into the Ireland area. Not a ton of stuff over here either. There aren't really any rides in Ireland, just a lot of buildings with shops. Before we get there, there are a couple little animal areas. I think it's called Wolf Ridge. There's a wolf habitat, and there is also completely missing from my build just because there wasn't any space, an aviary, which is a pretty nice little aviary, and I did visit it when we were there, but unfortunately there wasn't enough room over here to put all that stuff in, so we're missing a little bit over here, but that's just a side effect of the way that things have to be built in the game on the grid. Really wasn't any room to put things where they needed to go if I wanted to fit in absolutely everything, so had to give up on a couple things. So I tried to pick the things that I figured people would miss the least, I guess. For the most part, I did manage to get in every ride and every shop and restaurant that was on my inventory, on my list of things to build. The park layout is spread out enough that it was pretty easy to move things around if I needed to have a little bit extra room in order to make things fit on the grid. So that's one nice thing about Busch Gardens, that it's very spread out, so that makes the layout in RCT a lot easier to put together. But yeah, there are one or two things completely missing. Anyway, over here in Ireland, this might look a little bit different than the last time I showed it off. I have tweaked a few of the buildings over here to make them maybe a little bit more interesting, make them look maybe a little bit bigger, add some more details. For the most part, just a couple of restaurants and shops. There's a show building back here where there used to be, I believe, a dark ride or a motion simulator or something like that. There have been a couple things back here over the years. And as of my last visit, and I think currently there's nothing in here, but I could be mistaken. I'm sure someone will point it out in the comments. They always do. But yeah, a couple theaters over here. I think this is a large souvenir shop. We have our only ride back here, the Scream and Swing, Finnegan's Fire. This is a fun little build. It's pretty small for a Scream and Swing, but the real life one is pretty small as well compared to ones like Skyhawk at Cedar Point. So try to make it look a little bit shorter here as well. So it stands out well enough from the rest of buildings over in the Ireland area, so I feel like it probably does just fine. Crossing the bridge over here, that takes us into Scotland. Only one major ride over here, and that is of course Loch Ness Monster, the classic Arrow looper with its famous interlocking loops. Pretty happy with this one. I spent a lot of time trying to get the coasters to actually sync up on the loops. Sometimes they do it, sometimes they don't. That definitely wasn't a good sync there. But if you let it run long enough, eventually it'll get some. Maybe like every other time a coaster goes through the loops, they will sync up. I don't think there's a way to get them to do it consistently every single time. At least not with the build that I have here. You might be able to tweak the track a little bit or the timing of the chain lifts and dispatches which I've messed with those a lot already. See, that one almost worked. So you get a lot of almost synchronizations through the loops. As long as you can get them every now and again, I feel like that's going to be good enough. Another thing I changed since the last time we looked at Loch Ness Monster, I talked about not being super happy with the custom supports that I made for it. I had been using the wooden post fences and steel lattice pieces for the supports like I did with most other Arrow and Morgan builds that I made, like Corkscrew and Cedar Point and Steel Force and Dorney. And I originally had that here for Loch Ness Monster. Wasn't very happy with it, so I wanted to try some different techniques, see if I could figure out something that worked a little bit better. And I did wind up coming with something a little bit new. This isn't entirely my own design. I stole some of the techniques from a build of Blackpool Pleasure Beach that I saw recently. We are using some diagonal single roller coaster with the bottom half colored invisible, so it looks a little bit thinner. And then you can manually copy and paste those pieces in front of some posts and wooden post fence, and it looks pretty good. Obviously really tedious to do, even with Scenery Manager, to copy and paste these sections of track for every single support from all 4 angles. Still took a really long time, but I did like the way it turned out. I think it was worth the effort. I think these do look better than the original design I had, and they match some of the diagonal bits of support I have over here on the mid-course a little bit better as well, so makes things look a little bit more cohesive, which I like. So yeah, pretty happy with Loch Ness Monster, all things considered. Elsewhere in Scotland, we have our horse stables over here, and another spinny ride, the Little Clydes over here, just another fast merry-go-round kind of ride. Nothing much to talk about over here, not a whole lot to look at, but I think it's a nice little area. And that does bring us back to the front of the park, where we have our Skyride station here. I didn't mention that yet, but we do have Skyride in here as well, our 3-leg chairlift ride. Pretty happy with the way this one turned out as well. I was able to somehow get my park layout such that the 3 stations are all lined up pretty nicely, so you can get straight shots between each of them. So from here at the front of the park all the way down to the Jeremy station, it's a straight shot, so you don't have any weird corners on the chairlift that looked unnatural. Again, with RCT, you got to make sure everything is on the grid with rides like this, so they either have to be perfectly straight or perfectly diagonal. And yeah, so getting from Germany over here to France is also a straight shot on the diagonal, and it goes through the Immelman here on Griffin, which is pretty awesome. Very happy with the way that turned out. Some nice interaction. And then another straight diagonal back to the front of the park. So yeah, really happy with that. Worked out pretty nicely. I think that about covers the entirety of the park. There's more back lots you could look at if you wanted to. There's a secondary parking lot up here. Got some green space back here, some handymen keeping it nice and mowed, doing some good work. But yeah, mostly just did black tiling back here. At the edge of the park, some of it, I think there's some neighborhoods back here, some other like roads and things. I didn't want to build a bunch of extra buildings. Definitely wanted to keep it just to the park boundaries. So not a whole lot else to look at. More a forest back here as well. So nothing really too crazy to go over, but I do like the edge work. It is a lot of work to make these edges look the way they do, to move down every single individual tile on the map to get the smoother diagonal kind of edges here, and then pull up the black tile to have a nice shallow edge here. So yeah, that's a lot of work, but I think it turned out pretty nicely. I like the way it looks a lot. It worked well on Dorney, and I think it works pretty well here too. So yeah, that about covers my tour of Busch Gardens Williamsburg. So if you've been following the whole series, I hope you enjoyed it. This was a lot of fun to put together. This was a ton of work. I think this was even more work to build than Dorney, but it is a pretty big park, so I guess that makes sense. As I mentioned before, this was for a park creation contest over on the DKMP Discord server. This one wound up getting 4th place, which I was very happy with. It was a fantastic contest. I highly recommend you go check that out if you're into park recreations, and if you're here, you probably are. There are a lot of really great entries in there. Some really tough competition and some really awesome builds. I highly recommend you go check those out. There will be a link to that in the description of this video if you want to see those for yourself. And there will also be a link to the final version of this build. There have been a couple different final versions. The one I submitted to the contest was a little bit different from this. There are some things that I've tweaked since then, like the Tempesto train, as I mentioned earlier, a couple other small mistakes. So if you want to get the updated version of that, you can get that from the video's description. But other than that, I think that wraps up the Busch Gardens Williamsburg recreation. Again, hope you enjoyed it. This is a lot of fun. Definitely not going to do another recreation of this skill anytime soon. Of course, I say that every time, but yeah, these are a lot of work and definitely can get you burned out pretty quickly. But that's going to do it for this video. Again, hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.